Today we read from the 4th chapter of Matthew. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But Jesus answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, God will command the angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said, "Again it is written, do not put the sovereign your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their splendor. And he said to him, "All these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the sovereign your Lord and serve only God." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. This is the gospel of Christ.
Thanks
to God for grace and truth.
So right at the very beginning, before he did anything else, before he sat down to teach, before he called any disciples, before he healed anyone, before he challenged the authorities, Jesus went out into the desert. Right from the very start, he went out there all by himself. You think it was the first time? He was about 30 years old. Perhaps he's done this before, but we know this. He went and did it at least once. He didn't start his ministry until after this. Out in the desert. What's out there in the desert? Silence, mostly. You know, a walk in the desert is not like a walk in the woods. There are no trees out there to make the wind sing. No birds to sing either, maybe just a few croaking ravens. There are no sounds of the streets or the markets or the neighbors, no nearby houses with children or someone working with tools. The desert where Jesus went is a barren desert, rocky, dry, very dry. And Jesus went out there without food. He must have found some water, but he was out there for a long time. The Bible tells us 40 days without any food. Why? Why did he wander off like that? It must have been important because he was risking his life, because people who wander off into the desert sometimes are never able to wander back out again. You can get lost. So why did he go? Why did he go? Who remembers? We just read it. Why did he go? Shelley. It was a test. Jesus went out in a test. But there was something else that we read that said, why did he go? He went out into the desert because the Spirit led him. The Spirit led him. It says that right in the Bible. You all heard it. If you weren't listening, you heard it anyhow. The Spirit led him. What Spirit led him? The breath of God, the wind of God, the Spirit wind led him out there into the desert. The Spirit that spoke to Moses by that bush that burned but didn't burn up. The Spirit that blew Jacob out into the desert and later came and wrestled with him. The breath that Abram breathed when he decided to leave his home in Ur and travel to a far-off land. The blowing wind of God that dried Elijah out, dried him right out, and then whispered to him, Elijah, what are you doing here? The Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness. And why? Now you can answer. Why? Why, Shelley? To test him. It says right in the Bible, the Spirit blew him into the wilderness so that the devil could test him. Now stop right there. Stop it. I know what you're doing, and I want you to stop it. Are you picturing the little red guy with the horns and the pitchfork? That is not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about that. This gets a little bit complicated. But if you are picturing that character, you are far from what the Bible is talking about. And if you think temptation is the desire for bad things, you're getting the wrong image too. The picture of the devil, of Satan, takes on different looks in the Bible. At different places, it seems to be a little bit different. But mostly, the devil is a messenger, a servant of God, whose job is to test you and your faith to see exactly how strong your faith is. It's Satan's job to check on people and see if their faith is true and strong. Mostly, Satan is not an evil being, except in the fact that evil, like the teacher with the pop quiz, is evil. Satan is not an evil being. Satan is there to test you. And the Spirit blew Jesus out into the wilderness to test him so that he would find out exactly where his faith is. So, can God trust you? If God can trust you, Satan will find out whether that is the case or not. So the word that gets translated as tempting, Jesus was out into the wilderness to be tempted, would be better translated as tested. The Spirit led Jesus in the wilderness where his faith could be tested. It was Jesus' solo flight. It was a time he had to go and find out for himself just what was happening. Did Jesus have the spiritual strength to carry out what he was about to do? Did he have the message from God clear enough in his own mind that he could share it with others? Would he be faithful? Could he be trusted with the truth? This is what Satan had to find out. And he was absolutely certain that Jesus needed to know whether he could be trusted with the truth. Was he really going to be the Savior? Really? He needed to know. So the Spirit led him out into the wilderness to be tested. Now do yourself a favor, and don't take this too literally. This is a story that is presented about Jesus. It seems like it happened suddenly and all at once, but surely Jesus was tested every day of his life. Every day of his life, it was a test to see if he could carry the message of God, if he could live in God's light so much that it would radiate off of him and other people would see it. He can't possibly have been the only time in his ministry that he went off. We know the Bible tells us there were times when he went off by himself onto a mountaintop or somewhere else to pray. So this is one of those examples of a time when that happens. There was a time when I was a lot younger than I am today. Before I was a dad, I was on a camping trip with my brother and his family and some other family relatives. We were camping together. At one point, my brother, who had been off doing something, I forget what, came back to the camp, and his little daughter, who was, I guess, about 3 years old at the time, ran to him laughing, and he laughed, and he bent down, and he caught her, and he lifted her way up in the air and then held her close like that, and it really, really made me mad. It made me angry to see something like that. It made me anxious and angry that that little 3-year-old had to depend on him like that. What if he hadn't caught her? And why would I be thinking that thought? Why would I be giving that thought any question? The answer was because when I was 3 or 4 years old, there was no guarantee that the parents would catch me. There was no certainty that I would be welcomed into arms that would hold me close. So my own anxiety got the better of me in that situation. It was a test. And I sat by a creek for a long time that afternoon and thought about it. I couldn't go into the desert because I was in Pennsylvania. But I sat by a creek in a quiet woods for a long time and thought about it. And that actually eventually got me into therapy, where I could begin the healing process that I had to go through before I could raise healthy children of my own. This is what was happening with Jesus. He had to be purified in the desert. He had to put away his own desires. He had to put away whatever it was he thought he might want. He had to face the difficulties, the fears, the anxieties, the troubles that were coming for him, the prejudices and biases that he had been raised with. He had to face those and burn them away. He had to test himself to see if he could manage his own desires to have things the way that he wanted them. So the Spirit blew him with a hot, dry wind out into the desert, and Jesus went to face the test. And out there, the Gospels tell us that Jesus faced 3 different tests. And we're going to look at each one of them over the next 3 Sundays. This week, we're going to begin with the first one, maybe the most complicated one. And then the 2 weeks after that, we will talk about 2 other temptations, tests that Jesus faced. And then it's Palm Sunday, and then Maundy Thursday, and then Good Friday, and then Easter. So here's the first temptation. What was it? The first thing, the first test. What was it that Satan said for Jesus to do? Turn the rocks into bread. Turn rocks into bread. At what point are we in this story? It says Jesus has been out there for a long time already, and he's famished. And so Satan says, hey, lots of rocks, plenty of rocks, turn some into bread, and have something to eat. What would be so wrong about that? I'm asking you. Now, I've got 5 answers to that question. We'll see if we are in agreement about it. But why? Why was that a test? What would have been wrong with that idea of Jesus taking some of the power he'd been given and turning rocks into bread? What would have been wrong? First thing was he would have had to give up his quest. What was he doing out there? What had he determined to do? What was it? He was out there to fast, which means what? Don't eat, right? That was what he went out there. Why was he decided not to eat anything? A little trickier question. But this is a spiritual practice that is not just Christian, but all over the world different people do this, to go without eating in order to have a different perspective, to see things, maybe to have a vision. He wasn't out here in the desert for bread. If he wanted to eat, he could have just stayed home and had something to eat. He went out into the desert to go without the food, to test himself. He wanted to know, do I desire God so deeply that I would give up everything else for that? He was out there to understand who he was. You know, he just had this experience where he was baptized by John in the Jordan River, and he heard a voice that said, "You are my son, I'm well pleased with you." And Jesus was out there in the desert, not to have something to eat, but to find out what that meant. And he was not prepared to give up his quest, so he said no to turning bread into stones. Stones into bread. He wasn't going to give up his faith. What do you know about manna? M-A-N-N-A. What do you know about it? Anyone? Besides Shelley, who has all the answers. What do you know about manna? Anybody? Waiting for them to eat. It was some kind of bread that appeared in the desert when they were out there with nothing else. And it was God's promise to them that you will have enough. Every day they had to pick it. They couldn't pick it. If they picked enough for 2 days, it would go bad. They picked enough for 1 day because the message was, God will provide you what you need when you need it. And Jesus was out there in the desert and he was testing that question. Does God give me what I need when I need it? And to have turned those stones into bread meant, I can't trust God. I can't trust God. I've got to do this for myself. Also, it was a distraction. Why is he out in the desert? Why the desert? It's quiet. There are no distractions. He didn't need to worry out there in the desert about what other people thought of him, because there weren't any other people. He didn't need to worry about what he looked like, because there was nobody to see him. He didn't need to worry about making any money, because there wasn't anything to buy. He didn't need to worry about food. It was simple. There wasn't any. And he knew that his body was capable of carrying him for weeks without eating. He didn't need to set aside time to sleep, to read, to study, to answer his email, to check Facebook, to watch the news, to make that committee meeting, and on and on and on and on. He didn't have to do any of that stuff. All he had to do was pray. Sometimes that sounds just wonderful to me. Life is simple. Just pray. Listen for God. And finally, what a lot of you have said, he didn't want to use this power for himself. We hear stories about Jesus and we read about the miracles that Jesus did, and when you think about them, all the miracles that Jesus did were for someone else. He never benefited from the miracles that he performed. It was always for someone else. And here is the ultimate temptation for someone who has the power of God in them. Use that power for yourself. And he wouldn't do it. There are people who have power in churches because they are charismatic or because they are, like myself, extraordinarily handsome. There are people in churches who have power because they're so intelligent and so good with words, and sometimes they use that for themselves. And sometimes I've done that. When we do that, when we use God's gifts for ourselves, we have failed the test that God has given us. When we use the gifts that God has given us to enrich ourselves or to give ourselves power, we have failed the test. And finally, and this is the one several of you said, to place our needs above our spiritual needs. Maybe this is the biggest lesson. What drove Jesus into the wilderness?
Spirit.
What drove Jesus into the wilderness? The Spirit of God, the wind of God, the Spirit. Jesus was living in the Spirit that blew him into the desert, drove him there, and he was out there in the desert, and he was breathing it, the Spirit of God, to understand it. And what do you do? And what do I do? What do you and I do? What do we do to make sure that we are growing spiritually in ways, instead of all the other ways that we have in our lives? I've gone out on hikes. I've gone out on long walks and drives sometimes. I go out there to pray and to meditate. Of course, I take my cell phone along because one of you might call, right? And other distractions. I might get an important message after all on my cell phone. But Jesus didn't do that. He couldn't, of course, and he wouldn't. He understood that the spiritual life is the essence of life. To be about the needs of the body is not a sin because we have needs. But to do that and not be concerned with the needs of the soul is a foolish way to live. It's death. To live, we need more than bread. We need everything spoken by God. We need to find ways to find it. To listen for ways to listen to God. To look for ways to see God. We need to breathe and breathe and breathe God's breath. To breathe it. Breathe it. Breathe it. Because here in this room, because we are here in the name of Jesus, the Spirit of God is here. Breathe it. Maybe it will lead you out into the woods today. Our lives are so often like deserts because we don't listen. I ask God to drag us into the quiet places. And let's do that. Let us somehow find ourselves in the desert and we can hear what God has to say to us.
You've been listening to a sermon by Reverend Stephen Carnahan, pastor of High Street Congregational Church in Auburn, Maine. If you feel inspired by what you hear, you're invited to join us in person for worship services every Sunday morning, starting at 10 o'clock. Of course, you can always listen to Steve's sermons on the web. New sermons are posted every Monday by midday. Please explore this website for more information about our church, or visit our Facebook page at High Street Congregational Church, UCC, where you'll find the video version of Steve's sermons as well. We hope that God's presence will be known to you every hour of every day. May God's blessings rest upon you now and always. See you next week.